Reclaiming central space immediately shapes the battlefield, opening diagonal lines for early piece activity. Opening the king's flank so early is quite aggressive, potentially creating immediate weaknesses. Confronting the Dutch immediately. This central thrust aims to punish black's flank deviation with aggressive pawn play, instantly opening a path for your king. This captures the pawn but creates immediate, dynamic tactical possibilities for white, opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop. nc3 immediately contests the central pawn while preparing development. Developing a knight to its natural square reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for castling. Instantly, white sacrifices pawn material to disrupt black's pawn structure and aim for a lead in development. Reinforcing the center with a pawn opens lines and builds a dynamic pawn chain, creating potential for counterplay. Opening the f-file immediately offers a direct assault, but it sacrifices pawn structure for initiative. Reclaiming the pawn solidifies black's central presence, opening avenues for piece development and preparing for a spirited fight. Targeting the e4 pawn with the bishop, white immediately seeks to disrupt black's central pawn chain and create tactical possibilities. Developing the bishop to f5 immediately challenges white's advanced pawn structure and opens diagonals for future piece activity. Prioritizing piece development and central influence. This knight repositions to support the pawn chain and prepare for potential kingside expansion. Developing knights to active squares is crucial, preparing for further central engagement. Securing the monarch behind a protective pawn shield is paramount for future middlegame initiatives. Reinforcing the pawn chain on the kingside. This allows for a more robust structure against white's encroaching pieces. Unpinning the knight and preparing to disrupt black's pawn structure opens lines for development. Asserting dominion over the queenside. This pawn advance challenges the bishop's comfortable post and aims to disrupt white's development. Retreating the bishop aims to preserve it from attack, but it concedes crucial central squares and allows black further development. Bringing the queen to d7 aims to solidify the e4 pawn and prepare for queenside expansion, while also potentially unpinning the knight. Pinning the knight on f6 introduces immediate tactical friction, forcing black to address the potential disruption to their kingside structure. Securing the king behind a pawn shield, but simultaneously neglecting central development and potential counterplay against white's open files. Securing the king by moving it off the vulnerable diagonal clears the path for potential f-file action. Adding a defensive layer while preparing for future development. Reorganizing the bishop's influence. Preparing to contest the long diagonal and potentially support the queenside expansion. Exchanging the bishop opens the f-file, potentially weakening your king's safety and giving black more queenside space. Reclaiming the bishop frees the dark-squared bishop and prepares to contest the open file, aiming for queenside counterplay. Opening the d-file creates immediate pressure on black's queenside castle. Embracing the open e-file now offers a tangible path to piece activity. Trading bishops here clarifies the central pawn structure, potentially opening lines towards black's doubled pawns. This pawn structure, broken and isolated on the queenside, creates long-term structural weaknesses for black's position. Unlocking the queen's diagonal opens attacking avenues against the exposed black king. Unpinning the knight and preparing to contest the open d-file. This move initiates a strategic dance for central control, a subtle redeployment of your queen to prepare a central pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's bishop pair. The queen repositions, seeking an active role on the open d-file and preparing for potential pawn pushes. Stepping back, the knight now eyes the c5 square, potentially disrupting black's queenside pawn structure. Challenging white's queenside pawn structure. This move aims to disrupt white's coordination and open lines for black's pieces, solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for potential piece exchanges, while subtly aiming to restrict black's bishop activity. Initiating a flank attack with the h-pawn aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines against the enemy monarch, opening a diagonal for the bishop. This knight maneuvers to a commanding out-of-place square, daring black to exploit white's pawn structure. A bold pawn push, aiming to shatter the pawn structure and gain central dominion, though it leaves the king potentially exposed. Seizing the initiative, white embraces the open lines created, forcing a dynamic liquidation and aiming to exploit the weakened kingside, unleashing the passed pawn with tempo. This pawn thrust dramatically opens lines and threatens white's vulnerable king. Unleashing the queen to re-engage the center and the kingside is a bold initiative, seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn deluge, black aims to shatter white's central structure, though the exposed king looms large. Unleashing a devastating royal fork. This move exploits the pinned king and queen, forcing a decisive material gain. Abandoning the shelter of the pawn chain, the king ventures into the open, a precarious situation given white's centralized queen and bishop. Reclaiming central influence, this knight repositions to pressure black's weakened pawn structure. Targeting the vulnerable c3 knight with the queen forces a positional concession, potentially opening lines for black. A dazzling knight fork, exploiting the king's exposed position and threatening a decisive material win. A desperate attempt to consolidate an exposed monarch, sacrificing king's safety for a futile attempt to regroup. Opening the b-file unleashes the rooks, eyeing the weakened queenside pawn structure. Abandoning the queenside pawn structure for this open file action is a bold, but potentially risky, gambit. Sharpening the attack, this knight repositions to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially fork the queen and rook, boldly venturing the queen into enemy territory, sacrificing tempo for a bold initiative and central pressure. Unleashing the rook along the open file cracks open the opposing king's sanctuary with immediate mating threats, seeking to escape the pin and consolidate his beleaguered king. Black steers his monarch towards the relative safety of the queenside. Consolidating the rook on the open e-file pressures black's vulnerable king. Preparing for further infantry advances or tactical incursions, the black queen strategically repositions, creating a powerful diagonal threat and preparing to exploit white's exposed king. Unleashing a discovered attack on the king. This pursuit aims to dismantle black's central control and exploit its exposed monarch. The king's sanctuary crumbles. Evasive maneuvering is now paramount to avoid immediate checkmate threats. Securing the king behind the pawn shield offers respite, a moment to consolidate amidst the encroaching threats. Reasserting the bishop's presence on the queenside attempts to prevent white's rooks from exploiting the open c-file. Unleashing the rook opens lines towards black's exposed monarch, creating immediate tactical threats. Unleashing a powerful rook threat, black aims to exploit the newly opened g-file and harass the white king. Asserting dominance on the open file, white aims to dismantle black's weakened king's defenses. Relocating the king to the side attempts to escape the immediate rook pressure along the open files, and potentially find sanctuary. The knight's retreat allows black's bishop a clear path to disrupt white's central pawn structure. A desperate attempt to disrupt the encroaching white queen, but it only exposes the black king further. Prioritizing the king's safety by creating an escape square against the dangerous rook is a sound defensive maneuver. Fleeing the coming storm on the kingside, black seeks refuge for the queen, but leaves the now exposed d-file vulnerable to white's continued assault. Unleashing a relentless rook pressure. White aims to exploit the exposed black monarch on the open files. The bishop retreats, seeking active squares and preparing to bolster the queenside, but risks becoming a target on the open board. Exploiting the open file, this exchange cracks open the kingside and aims to disrupt black's defensive structure. Sacrificing material to disrupt the opponent's defensive pawn structure and gain an initiative often leads to fireworks, unleashing a rook's potential to disrupt black's central defense and exploit the weakened king. Escaping the storm of rook attacks, the king desperately seeks refuge on the queenside, a fragile haven, a decisive blow that sacrifices material to expose the black king to a swift mating attack. Sacrificing the king to avoid immediate mate seems desperate, but it might open pathways for counterplay. King's safety is paramount. White's queen now menacingly penetrates, aiming to expose the black monarch further. Regaining the queen offers scant comfort. The king's remaining escape routes are severely restricted. Sacrificing the queen to force checkmate secures a crushing victory, exposing the black king's utter vulnerability. Embracing the inevitable sacrifice, black's king sprints into a dangerous open space, hoping for a miracle escape. Chasing the black king with this check forces it further into the open, creating more attacking chances. Protecting the king from the open files is the paramount concern now, lest the queen's foraging become a fatal pursuit. The monarch's precarious position now invites a decisive check, forcing its retreat and simplifying the position towards a winning advantage. A desperate attempt to escape the tightening net, but it only leads further into the heart of the storm. Sacrificing the queen on g4 forces an immediate queen exchange, heading towards a winning endgame by eliminating black's most active piece. The queen's capture seals white's decisive material advantage, ushering in a straightforward endgame victory. Gaining the passed pawn on the kingside opens up clear winning chances in this simplified position. Now that the pawns are cleared, the rook can finally establish dominance on the open d file, aiming for infiltration and disruption. Forcing the black king into a mating net, this check exploits the open files and shattered pawn structure. The black king, exposed and vulnerable, now faces a decisive onslaught with the pawn capture. Seizing the open files now, white aims to eliminate black's last pawn and begin a winning rook endgame. Swapping pieces here offers a reprieve from the immediate tactical storm. Consolidating your advantage by securing the crucial 7th rank offers a clear path to victory. The king, now exposed after that relentless pawn push, seeks refuge on the kingside, hoping for a safer haven. Unleashing a checking cascade, white seeks to exploit black's exposed monarch before settling into the inevitable pawn-filled endgame. The king's desperate dash continues, seeking refuge from the relentless queen and rook pressure. Pawn push secures a vital queenside outpost, preventing further infiltration. The rook's retreat to the 2nd rank aims to solidify the defense and prepare for a potential pawn advance. Shifting the king to the side allows for better coordination with the rook, aiming to consolidate and simplify. The persistent rook check aims to exploit the exposed white king's position. Propping up the pawn chain with g3 solidifies the center, a sound positional adjustment after the recent exchange. The rook retreats, preserving its presence on the c6 square, ready for potential infiltration. Advancing the pawn aims to restrict black's rook and create escape squares for the king. Probing the weakened king's escape routes with the rook, opening a path for the king. This push creates immediate tactical pressure on black's weakened position. Protecting the pawn and maintaining the advanced king's position offers a sliver of hope in this grim situation. Exploiting the open file offers a decisive check and forces the king to a worse square. The king's precarious journey to the queenside offers a slim chance to prolong the defense against the advancing pawns. Raiding the queenside pawns seals the material advantage. A decisive blow against black's exposed king. A last-ditch check aiming to disrupt white's centralized king and force concessions. Protecting the king from further checks is paramount, aiming to consolidate the remaining pieces. Sacrificing the rook to create a passed pawn on the queenside is a desperate attempt to gain counterplay. Pushing this pawn opens a desperate path, aiming to outflank the king and create a passed threat. The black king, now exposed on the kingside, must seek refuge behind the remaining pawns or risk immediate destruction. Securing the rook on the queenside creates a powerful outpost. Seeking shelter on the queenside offers a potential refuge from the relentless pawn storm. Advancing the pawn now seals black's fate, a clear path to promotion opening up. The king's retreat seeks refuge. But the rook on a6 now controls the only open file available for escape. The monarch repositions, seeking a safer haven from potential checks and readying to support the pawn advance. Gaining breathing room for the king is paramount as the rook activates on the open file. Pushing the pawn forward aims to restrict the black king's escape routes further. This retreat from the queen's protection allows white to consolidate the central passed pawn. A significant positional gain. Initiating a decisive pawn push by forcing the opponent's king onto a vulnerable file. Sacrificing material to maintain control of the open files is the primary objective now. The a pawn advances, seeking to create a passed pawn that will decide the game.